So, welcome everyone to episode 29 of our Talk Room series of podcasts, Being Your Best Self. And for those people who haven't seen any of our previous podcasts, I'd like to introduce my co-presenter, Wendy. Wendy is a highly experienced CBT psychotherapist, worked in the field of mental health, in well-being more generally, for well over 30 years now. So once again, Wendy, an absolute pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Ian, for that introduction. And also, for those who don't know you, you are a senior accredited counsellor with the National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, and also the founder of Hope Therapy and Counselling Services, a counselling practice which offers counselling and therapeutic support throughout the UK. So a warm welcome to you, Ian.
Thank you, Wendy. That's really kind. And today we're also joined by Helen. Helen is part of the Hope Therapy and Counselling team, having qualified a little over 10 years ago now. So very experienced counsellor and therapist. Works with a wide range of different presentations and conditions, but today we're going to be talking about a particular speciality of Helen's, which is called boarding school syndrome. So maybe we could just start, Helen, with you just saying a few words about what is boarding school syndrome.
Yeah, hello, Ian and Wendy, and thank you for having me here as a guest. A brief definition of boarding school syndrome. So it's a collection of symptoms, in inverted commas, or behaviours experienced by an adult as a result of having gone to boarding school as a child. So these behaviours develop due to the attachment being broken from their family, from growing up within an institution, perceived or actual expectations placed on them whilst at school, and in many cases, experiences such as bullying and abuse.
Okay, that's really interesting. So thank you, Helen. And I guess just to start, how did you become interested in what is a really fascinating subject?
Yeah, it is. So several years ago, I randomly stumbled across a Nick Duffel's documentary called The Making of Them. I found it quite eye-opening, and I then started looking online for different boarding school related documentaries and articles. And then a boarding school syndrome CPD event came up where you could either attend for just the weekend or you could count that weekend's training towards a full qualification. So I was becoming increasingly interested in boarding school syndrome by this time. So when I attended the CPD day, I found myself feeling envious of the people who had signed up for the full course. So ultimately, I ended up registering for it myself.
And and did you go to boarding school yourself?
I did not. And initially, I couldn't quite understand why I'd become so fascinated with the subject. My mum went though. And throughout the course, the connection between her going to boarding school and my interest became apparent. So learning about boarding school syndrome helped me understand my mum better, and also our relationship, because of course she grew up in an institution setting, whereas I went to a day school. And often we'd say to each other, I love you, but I don't get you.
Well, that's really amazing and interesting, Helen, and the story of how you got interested in it to help to better understand your mother. So could you tell us a little bit more about why people get boarding school syndrome in the first place?
Yeah. So when children are sent away to boarding school, the attachment to their caregivers is broken, and they're then cared for day to day by teachers, housemasters, mistresses who don't love them. On top of this, they're suddenly torn away from everything they know. So not just their family, but it's their home, their bedroom, their pets, community, everything they're familiar with. For some, it can be like a period of bereavement. And when the realization comes that they're there to stay, some people can then shut down their emotions in order to survive. As their loved ones are not around, they soon learn to become very self-sufficient. So that will often mean learning to stuff down their emotions since nobody's around to comfort them, or worse, they might be teased for showing vulnerability. Bullying and abuse are often prominent in institutional settings, which means that children growing up in boarding school are potentially in an environment where they need to be constantly on their guard.
Mm. Again, very interesting answer there, Helen. Thank you so much for that. My next question is, what kind of symptoms do people with boarding school syndrome experience? Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as mentioned, the child shuts down or dissociates in order to survive. So Nick Duffel, who I mentioned earlier, he suggests that one of 3 strategic survival personalities take over. So these are called complier, rebel, and crushed. The problem is that the child will end up taking this into their adult life, by which time the personality styles are no longer helpful for them. So, for example, a complier might struggle to acknowledge their shadow side. The crushed might feel shame in recognizing that despite their robust upbringing, they actually find it difficult to cope with everyday life. And the rebel might identify with this part of them so much that they fear being any different might make them become unnoticed. A child who learns to shut down emotions becomes an adult who can't then suddenly switch them back on. And this, along with the absence of role models, can then leave them in a situation where relationships are really difficult to navigate. They've learned not to acknowledge or show feelings. And it is often the romantic partner who is first to spot the issues. So if we don't process our emotions, they have to come out somehow. And this can also sometimes show later in life through unrecognized physical conditions. And also, you don't have to be directly bullied yourself to be affected by bullying. Knowing in itself that it's happening around you and potentially worrying that you might be next can be very stressful and can lead us to being in a constant fight or flight mode. Again, this can follow us into adult life and take the form of anxiety or dissociation. There may be feelings of what we call survivor's guilt, or shame at being too fearful to dog them in. Dissociation can also often mean that as adults there are big gaps in childhood memories. People with boarding school syndrome often present with a poor sense of self. So they may say things like, I don't know who I am, because throughout their early years, they were told day after day what to do, when to do it, what to eat, who to be. And this can leave them really confused about the difference between who they really are and who they've told they should be.
Again, really fascinating answer there, Helen. And your depth of knowledge on this subject is really coming across. So, does everybody who goes to boarding school ends up suffering with this condition?
No, in the same way that not everyone who witnesses a traumatic event will end up getting PTSD, not everyone who goes to boarding school ends up getting boarding school syndrome. But the thing to remember is that although called boarding school syndrome, it's more of a cluster of behaviours rather than a disease or an illness. And severity of symptoms might depend on the robustness of their attachment before going away, the level of support contact they have from caregivers whilst away, and also the age they were when they were sent. For some people, they may not recognise their symptoms as being linked to boarding school. For example, they might see themselves as having anxiety, but not make the connection.
So, so based on your understanding and the work that you've done, I mean, what's your personal view about boarding schools? Do you think they should be banned? Do you think they should be allowed? What do you think about that?
I don't think children should be sent to boarding school until they're much older, if at all possible. I appreciate that the education and facilities can be fantastic, but attachment is so fundamental to our development, and living in an institutional setting breaks it. I think puberty is tough enough without having to go through it away from your caregivers, even just knowing that they're there and they support you. Clients will often say, my parents told me I said I wanted to go to boarding school. But realistically, how can a young child comprehend what it will actually be like to live away from home in those vital years?
Mm. And Helen, you've given us a really good understanding of the behaviours and the background and the kind of conditions you can expect somebody with these problems to have. I wonder if you could perhaps now go on to tell us a little bit more about how therapy can help somebody with this syndrome. Could you tell us a
Yeah,
little bit about that? Thank you.
yeah. So ex-boarders can often be reluctant to seek therapy because they are so used to being self-sufficient. So they might feel as if they're making unnecessary fuss, or there may be shame attached to seeking help. But if they are able to enter into therapeutic work, a therapist can help them to rebuild their sense of self, understand their emotions and help them connect to them, ultimately benefiting their interpersonal relationships. The therapist will listen to the ex-boarder's stories of loneliness, confusion, or shame, and help them to make sense of what happened to them. Sharing our stories of trauma diminishes their power and allows us to move forward. As broken attachment is at the base of boarding school syndrome, therapeutic work will need to take place if the client wants to try and heal this. So the therapist might use reparenting approaches or help the client to reparent themselves. For example, Nick Duffel, who I mentioned earlier, describes the therapist-client relationship as one similar to that of auntie-nephew or uncle-niece, etc. So the nurturing is there, but it's perhaps one step removed from that of a parent. The therapist will know it takes courage to seek help. They will provide an environment of safety where anything's okay to discuss without judgment or shock. They will listen to the client's story, they'll hold the space so that they can explore their thoughts and feelings. They might also teach grounding techniques for use in anxious situations. So when we're in an environment day after day, it becomes our normality. So this can mean that we get used to not being around love and being around bullying and abuse and normalize it. I've heard adult ex-boarders tell awful stories of abuse, but they only fully realised it was abuse when it's specifically pointed out to them. So a therapist can help them understand that what seemed normal but didn't perhaps quite feel right was in fact wrong or even abusive. Inner child work can play an important role in the therapeutic process. So this is about recognising the child that's within us and who was, and paying attention to what their needs were, which needs were met and which were not. So an example of that might be holding a soft toy that represents their younger self and talking to it with compassion. Also, empty chair work can be very powerful. So this is where the client talks to an imagined person sitting on an empty chair as if that person were there. So it can be a very effective outlet for expressing the previously unexpressed, and it can be really releasing. So that might be an exercise such as shouting at the house mistress who was mean to you at school, but you've got the safety of knowing that those words and expressions will never actually leave the room, and knowing that the therapist is supporting you through the process. Sometimes it's about grieving the past, maybe working through the grief of leaving their home, which they may have never had the opportunity to process at the time. It all might seem a bit daunting, but a good therapist will work together with the client and at the right pace for them. So it's about what works best for the client.
Absolutely fascinating once again, Helen. And I guess I'm wondering if somebody's watching or listening to this, and maybe they're recognizing some of the things that you're describing, and they may think that they may have boarding school syndrome. What should they be doing? What comes next?
Well, my recommendation would be to find a therapist who specialises in boarding school syndrome. You can find a therapist by going onto the Boarding School Survivors website. If a specialist is not available in their area, they could try to find an experienced general trauma therapist. There are various workshops around the country, often single gender groups. Ex-boarders report having had different experiences depending on their gender. It can feel validating and empowering to be in a supportive environment with others who have had similar experiences to you. If the idea of therapy feels too much at first, interventions such as yoga nidra, mindfulness, meditation, grounding techniques, they can all be helpful for relaxation, being in the moment, and connecting to our body. So often ex-boarders are what we call in their head or intellectualizing, but actually we can store feelings in our body. So it can be important to allow for these to be acknowledged and processed. Other creative work can also be helpful, things like art, dance therapy, journaling. More and more resources are becoming available. So there's books, there's autobiographies, podcasters such as Piers Cross on YouTube. There's publications, documentaries, even support for partners and friends of ex-boarders. And just a few weeks ago, Charles Spencer gave a sobering interview about his time at boarding school. Piers Cross, who I just mentioned, is currently working on a new documentary, which I think is going to be groundbreaking. So the good news is that the awareness of boarding school syndrome is increasing. And of course, with awareness, we can move towards a better understanding and more widely available support.
Well, Helen, that sounds so really, really interesting and very intriguing as well. All the detailed sort of therapeutic interventions you can use. You could say much more on each one of those. So that was really, really interesting. And I just wondered if anybody wants to find out more about boarding school syndrome, what can they do?
Well, if people want to work with Helen or anybody else within the Hope team, they're very, very welcome to contact us. The web address is www.hopeforminds.co.uk. Just navigate over to the contact us section, and we can connect people with Helen or someone else within the team, depending on the specific nature of the support that they're looking for. We also have a whole variety of free resources up on the website as well, so people are very, very welcome to take a look at that. As I say, they're completely free. Wendy, you as well are very, very experienced trauma therapist, as well as being a CBT psychotherapist. So maybe just letting people know a little bit about yourself and what you can offer support with as well.
Yes, certainly, Ian. Thank you very much for that. Yes, so my website is called wendycastellino.com, and I specialize in CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, but also EMDR, which is a specialist trauma therapy, which really helps people to work with all kinds of traumas that Helen has mentioned, such as bullying and you're just feeling sad and isolated, or actually watching bullying happening and being in that fight or flight thing. And also compassion focused therapy, I'm very interested in just about developing more of a self-soothing relationship with yourself as well. So I think that applies to many of the situations, Helen, you mentioned. So thank you very much for that, for Ian. And thank you very much for everybody for joining the podcast. And it's been really fascinating, Helen. Thank you so much for being such an amazing guest. And thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.